She appeared at dawn, half hidden in the morning mist, stumbling through the open range like a ghost too stubborn to rest. Her dress was torn at the hem, black with soot, and her hair clung to her face in damp streaks of ash and sweat. No one saw where she'd come from. She simply emerged from the far end of the ridgeline, feet dragging through frost-bitten grass toward the Chuckwagon where the cowboys had gathered for breakfast. They watched in silence as she reached the fire, collapsed to her knees, and stared blankly at the flames, arms limp at her sides. Not a word passed her lips, not a plea, not a whimper, just that hollow stare that spoke louder than hunger ever could. The cook glanced at the foreman, who shook his head and muttered something about not feeding strays. But before the plate could be pulled away, a tall cowboy with a weather-beaten hat stepped forward. He didn't ask who she was or where she'd come from. He simply set his tin plate, full of beans, biscuit, and half a strip of bacon, on the log beside her, then sat down a few feet away and began sharpening his knife in silence. The other men returned to their coffee, half glancing but saying nothing. She didn't touch the food at first, just stared at it, lips trembling slightly, like it might disappear if she blinked. Then she lifted the biscuit with trembling fingers, cradled it like something holy, and took the smallest bite. The cowboy didn't look her way, but his eyes narrowed at the sight of smoke on her sleeves, the kind that clings long after a fire dies. Her boots, what was left of them, were charred at the toe, and one ankle was swollen. Someone had walked through hell to get here. When the plate was clean, she set it down slowly and tried to stand, but her knees gave out. The cowboy rose without a word and caught her before she hit the dirt. She didn't fight him, just leaned into his shoulder like she'd done it 1,000 times before. "We're moving out in an hour," the foreman barked. "Ain't got time for no lost woman drama." The cowboy didn't flinch. "She's not lost," he said calmly, helping her toward the wagon's shaded side. "She found us." No one argued. Maybe it was the way she looked at the fire, or maybe it was the way he didn't look at her at all, but still saw everything. Either way, she stayed. And the dog that normally snapped at strangers now lay curled beside her boots, nose twitching at the faint scent of ash. By midday, the cattle drive was back in motion, hooves stirring dust across the prairie and the sun bearing down like a silent judge. The woman rode in the supply wagon, tucked between sacks of flour and crates of dried beans, her head resting against a rolled tarp. No one asked her name. No one dared. But every now and then, a pair of eyes would flick back toward her, curious, cautious, and unsure what to make of someone who hadn't spoken a word since arriving. The cowboy who'd given her his plate, whose name was Reese, rode beside the wagon most of the morning. Not guarding, exactly. Just there, watching the horizon like it owed him something and only occasionally glancing to make sure she was still breathing. When the wagon hit a rut, her body jolted and she winced, one hand pressing to her side. Reese rode closer. "You hurt?" he asked, his voice low. She didn't answer, but her fingers curled tighter against her ribs. "We'll stop soon," he added. "Then we'll see." That was the moment he noticed it, tucked beneath the canvas behind her, a scorched strip of linen embroidered in red. It looked like part of a child's quilt. He didn't mention it. Not yet. When they stopped near a stream for water, Reese brought over a canteen. She took it slowly, as if the gesture required more courage than strength, and drank with small, careful sips. Then he saw it, more clearly now, the faint handprint on her arm, bruised deep into the skin, not fresh, days old, but deliberate. As he crouched beside her, she finally met his gaze, just for a second. And in that one glance, he saw more than he'd expected. Sorrow, yes, but also fury. like a woman who had buried something and wasn't done digging. Later, while the others joked around the fire, one of the younger cowhands, Jeb, leaned close to Reese and whispered, "You reckon she's trouble?" Reese didn't answer right away. He watched the woman carefully fold a clean cloth from the cook's kit and wipe soot from her fingers. Then she took a dented skillet and began slicing potatoes without being asked. "She can cook," Reese said finally, "and she knows how to disappear." Jeb raised an eyebrow. "That a good thing?" "It's a thing we all learn," Reese replied. "Eventually." As night fell, she placed the potatoes near the fire, her movements slow but precise. She still hadn't said a word. But she didn't need to. The fire caught her face just enough to reveal the outline of a burn near her hairline, and a look in her eyes that said someone had tried to erase her, and failed. The third day brought silence, wrapped in wind, the kind that whistles through grass and whispers between wagon spokes. The herd moved steady, the cowhands shouted less, and the woman, still unnamed, rose early to stir beans before the sun had cleared the ridge. She moved like someone who'd done this before, who knew how to feed men who didn't ask questions. But Reese noticed everything, the way her hands trembled when someone passed behind her, how she kept her back to the fire, and how she flinched each time metal clanged, as if every echo might be the start of something worse. When Jeb joked about her being a runaway wife or some outlaw's girl, Reese didn't laugh. Instead, he led his horse a bit farther out that morning, taking the long ride up the ridgeline. What he found made his jaw tighten. About a mile out, the blackened frame of a barn still smoldered in the wind. The earth around it was scorched, but near the edge of the ashes someone had scraped something into the dirt. A name. 3 letters. Sam. Below it, a handprint smaller than his palm. Reese crouched and traced it once with his gloved finger, then turned back toward camp with his jaw clenched. By the time he returned, the woman had finished the morning meal and was rinsing tins by the stream. Reese handed her the small rag doll he'd found buried under the ashes. Her breath caught, just barely. She clutched the doll to her chest and turned away, shoulders shaking once. Just once. Before she pulled herself back into stillness. That evening, as the men settled down and the stars blinked overhead, Reese set a plate next to her and said quietly, "I saw the barn." She didn't look up. "Saw the handprint? Was that his name? Sam?" She nodded so faintly he almost missed it. "Yours?" he asked, after a pause, her lips parted. One word. "Clara." Reese nodded once, slow. "You don't owe us anything," he said, "but if there's someone out there looking for you—" "There is," she whispered, the words raw like windburn. "He took the land, said I had 2 choices, leave or burn." Reese didn't ask what choice she'd made. He already knew. As the fire crackled and Clara leaned closer to the warmth, Scout, the old dog, curled beside her, one paw resting over the toe of her boot like a silent vow. The men didn't speak her name, but they stopped looking at her like a shadow. She wasn't just passing through anymore. She had a place at the fire. And tomorrow, Reese knew, she'd have a reason to stay. The next morning, Clara woke before the fire was lit, before the cattle stirred, before even the cook rolled out of his blankets. She sat alone beside the ashes, wrapping her shawl tighter against the chill. In her lap lay the ragged doll, its one stitched eye still clinging to its thread. She whispered something to it, too soft for Reese to hear, and placed it gently inside her knapsack, tying the flap shut with a knot that meant finality. When the others rose, they found her already cooking, slicing dried apples into the biscuit batter like she'd done it her whole life. The men watched her differently now, not with suspicion, but with a quiet sort of respect. Even the foreman, who'd grumbled about strays, took a bite and gave a nod. But Reese knew better than to be comforted. That burn on her wrist hadn't faded, and neither had the way she flinched when boots thudded behind her. Around noon, a rider appeared on the horizon, alone, fast, and coming from the east. Clara froze when she saw the silhouette. Reese noticed. She didn't speak, didn't run, just slowly stepped backward behind the wagon wheel, her hands gripping the dough-covered towel like it might shield her. The rider veered off when he saw the camp, spurred his horse hard, and vanished into the hills without slowing. Reese didn't chase him. Not yet. But later, when the others dozed, he rode out and checked the trail. Hoofprints, deep and recent, heading south. No supplies, no saddlebag, a scout. When he returned, Clara was sitting near the fire again, humming a lullaby no one recognized. He crouched beside her. "He found you," he said. "Not yet," she replied without looking up. "But he's close." "You could tell us who he is." She shook her head. "You'd go looking, and he's not like other men." Reese narrowed his eyes. "What is he?" She met his gaze. "The kind who burns things because he can't break them." For a long moment, Reese said nothing. Then he reached into his coat, pulled out a small iron key, and handed it to her. "There's a lockbox under the wagon bench. Inside's a pistol. If I'm not here when he comes, you'll use it." Clara didn't flinch. "I've already buried one home. I won't bury another." That night, when the wind picked up and the fire roared sideways, Clara sat closer to it than she ever had. Not for warmth, but for courage. And Scout, faithful and alert, stayed beside her, watching the darkness like he remembered flames. Reese didn't sleep that night. Neither did she. Something was coming. And this time, they wouldn't run. The next day brought a hush that settled over the drive like a bad omen. Even the cattle seemed uneasy, shifting in clusters with more lowing than usual, their ears twitching to sounds no one else could hear. Reese rode wide along the edge of the herd, eyes trained on the distant ridge. Clara stayed close to the wagon, her shoulders squared, apron on, pan in hand. But she hadn't cooked a thing all morning. She just stirred the same batch of dry beans over and over, like her thoughts were boiling and had nowhere to go. Near midday, the dog froze. Scout's ears perked, body stiff, nose pointed toward the rise behind them. Reese turned. At first he saw nothing, just rocks and heat shimmer. Then movement. A figure stood still on the crest, too far to make out clearly, but wrong somehow. The stance was familiar, too deliberate. Whoever it was stood just long enough to be noticed. Then vanished behind the rocks. Reese dismounted without a word and climbed the ridge. When he returned, his jaw was tight. "Single man, heavy boots, rifle," he said. "Didn't stay long. Wanted to be seen." Clara's face went pale. "He's not alone," she whispered. "He never is. He sends the warning first, then comes back at night." Reese nodded. "You have till sundown to decide. We can keep running, or we stand." "I'm tired of running," she said. "I buried my boy with a shovel. I'll bury that man with a bullet." No one challenged her resolve after that. The men, once skeptical, began quietly checking their rifles, retightening saddles, speaking in tones reserved for storm warnings. Clara moved with strange calm, rolling dough with steady hands now, handing out biscuits to the cowboys like she was feeding brothers at a last supper. That evening, she laid her apron aside and sat near the fire, sharpening the small kitchen knife with rhythmic strokes. Reese watched from across the flames, his own rifle resting on his knees. He didn't try to talk her down. He just kept her in his sight, as if watching her sharpen that blade was more important than watching the dark horizon. When the sky turned red, Scout lifted his head and growled low. No one moved. Clara reached behind her and pulled the lockbox from under the wagon bench. The key Reese had given her slid in without hesitation. She opened it, lifted the small pistol inside, and turned it over in her hands like she'd known it all along. The cowboy who once handed her his plate now nodded once across the fire. Not in approval, but in respect. The quiet kind that means, "I'll fight beside you when it comes." They made camp early that evening, not out of weariness, but strategy. The wagons were circled tighter than usual, the cattle drawn in close, and the firewood stacked high at the center like a signal. Clara placed a line of tin pans and pots around the chuckwagon, old cook's trick for rattling if someone stepped through in the dark. No one joked, no one asked questions. They all moved like men who'd seen fire before, and didn't plan on being surprised by it again. Reese loaded his rifle in silence, the click of each bullet sliding home louder than words. Scout paced restlessly between wagons, ears flat and hackles raised. Clara tucked the pistol into the folds of her skirt and sat on the wagon tongue, her chin high, eyes scanning the dark like she'd known it far longer than any of them. As night deepened, wind swept in from the east, cold and sharp, carrying a strange scent, something acrid, sour. Reese was the first to smell it. Then Clara's eyes went wide. "Kerosene," she whispered. "He's here." A crack echoed like dry bone snapping in the dark, then another, closer this time. A torch flared briefly near the edge of the herd, then vanished. The cattle stirred, restless. "Hold the line," the foreman barked, rifle raised. The men fell into place. Clara ducked behind the wagon, pistol in hand. Then came the voice, low, mocking from the shadows beyond the firelight. "I told you, Clara. You burn what's mine, I burn what's yours." Reese stepped into the firelight, his rifle leveled at the trees. "She's not yours." "She was, before she started feeding other men." The words hung like poison. Reese didn't flinch. "Step out, coward." Silence followed. Then a sudden whoosh, fire blooming at the far side of the camp, a torch hurled at the edge of the supply wagon. Clara was there in seconds, smothering the flames with a wet blanket, smoke curling around her face. Reese fired into the dark. A shout answered, then the thud of hooves galloping away. 2 riders, maybe 3. Not a full ambush, just a message. But that night, no one slept. They patrolled in shifts. Clara didn't lay down once. She stayed beside the fire, pistol resting across her lap, eyes never blinking for long. Reese watched her from the opposite side, his face cut sharp by the orange glow. The camp had survived, but just barely, and the fire hadn't taken the wagons, not this time. But the scent of smoke lingered in everything, in the pots, in the canvas, in Clara's hair. She hadn't broken. Not yet. But the storm hadn't finished either. It had just circled back. By morning the fire had died to embers, but Clara was still awake. Her eyes were rimmed with fatigue, yet steady. Reese brought her coffee, and she took it without a word, her fingers brushing his briefly, rough hands meeting hands that once kneaded dough. The cattle were restless, nerves still high from the night's ambush. Tracks in the dirt confirmed what Reese suspected. 3 riders had circled, lit the torch, then peeled off east towards the hills. Not bandits, scouts, taunting her. Clara knew the pattern. He liked to strike, wait, and watch his prey unravel before finishing the job. But this time she wasn't unraveling. She was sharpening. When the herd moved again, Clara rode with Reese on his spare horse, her skirt tucked up and pistol hidden beneath a flour sack in the saddlebag. She didn't ask where they were headed. He didn't tell her. By midday, they reached an old ranger outpost near a dry creek bed, abandoned but standing. Reese wanted to scout the route ahead. High ground gave the advantage if trouble returned. Inside the outpost's hollowed barn, he found something unexpected. A saddle. Old, cracked leather, branded with a mark he recognized. A half moon inside a circle. He brought it out, handed it down to Clara. Her breath caught. "That's his," she said. "He branded it himself. Said it meant everything under his moon belonged to him." She opened the saddlebag, expecting tools, maybe a canteen, but instead found a folded piece of paper. A letter, weather-worn and smudged, written in an uneven scrawl. Clara read it slowly, lips trembling. Then she crushed it in her fist and threw it into the dirt. "What did it say?" Reese asked. "He's not just hunting me," she said. "He's hunting the land. He's bought the claims from the old surveyor in town. He's pushing people off acre by acre, burning what won't sell." Reese's expression darkened. "And yours was one of the last?" "Mine was the first to say no," she whispered. "And Sam, my boy, he wouldn't leave, so the fire took both." Her voice broke, but the tears didn't come. They'd burned out long ago. Reese retrieved the letter, smoothed it against his thigh. "You want justice," he said. "No," Clara answered. "I want him to fear the fire he made." That night, they returned to camp with the saddle tied behind them like a signal. Clara carried herself, taller, eyes forward, every step deliberate. She no longer hid by the wagon. She stood beside the fire. And when the men looked her way now, it wasn't with curiosity. It was with allegiance. The line between cook and survivor had vanished. She was no longer a guest. She was a storm waiting to answer one. The next evening brought an eerie quiet. Even the wind seemed to pause, as if the land was holding its breath. The men sharpened blades and double-checked their rifles. But Clara? She was baking. Flour dusted her apron, and the smell of warm bread mingled with sage smoke as she placed small loaves near the coals. "Why now?" Jeb muttered. "She's cooking like it's a Sunday picnic." Reese didn't answer. He just watched her hands. Steady, focused, deliberate. Clara moved with the calm of someone who'd already lived through the worst day of her life. What came next wasn't fear. It was follow-through. When the last loaf cooled, she wrapped it in cloth, tied it with twine, and walked to the edge of camp. There she dug a small hole beneath a lone mesquite tree. Inside, she placed half a biscuit and the child's rag doll, now cleaned and stitched. She whispered something into the dirt, something only the land needed to hear, and covered it with a flat stone. "You said goodbye," Reese said softly, watching from a distance. "No," Clara replied. "I said wait for me." Later that night, Scout started growling again, low, throat deep. This time Clara didn't reach for her pistol. She simply stood. The men followed suit. The torch came first, then the voices. 3 riders at the ridge's edge, silhouetted by the moon, laughing like devils on a wind. One of them called out, "Cook, we missed your bread. Got any left for a man who owns you?" Clara stepped into the firelight. "Only crumbs for cowards." A shot cracked through the air, grazing the wagon post beside her. But she didn't flinch. Reese had already taken position behind the water barrel. He fired once, clean, sharp, and one of the shadows dropped from his horse. The others turned and rode off, but not before Clara lifted the pistol and fired a second shot. It wasn't perfect. The bullet caught the rider's shoulder, spun him sideways, but he stayed mounted. "That'll leave a mark," Reese said, approaching her. "He's not done," Clara replied, "but now he knows I'm not either." In the morning, Reese rode out and found the blood trail. It led south, toward town, toward the courthouse, toward deeds written in ink and backed by flame. When he returned, he brought news. The man's name was Elias Ward. He'd bribed the surveyor, forged 2 land claims, and left a string of fire-gutted farms in his wake. But now, thanks to Clara's shot, he'd made a mistake. He'd left behind something they could follow: blood, burned land, and a name in ink. Reese looked at Clara across the fire. "Time to finish this," he said. And this time, she didn't just nod. She smiled. They rode into town at dusk, the sky streaked red behind them like a warning. Reese wore his long coat and carried both rifles across his saddle. Clara rode beside him, upright, face bare, pistol tucked into the waist of her skirt like it belonged there. She didn't hide now. The townsfolk slowed their steps as they passed, eyes narrowing at the sight of a woman riding armed and unflinching. Outside the courthouse, a buggy stood with fresh mud splashed on the wheels. Inside sat Elias Ward, smug and clean in a pressed waistcoat, speaking to the land agent with a whiskey glass in hand. Clara didn't wait for introductions. She stepped into the room, cocked the hammer of her pistol, and laid the saddle down on the desk with a thud that silenced every voice. "Recognize that?" she asked, her voice sharp enough to slice bone. Elias blinked, then sneered. "You stole my property." "That's my child's name carved inside," she replied. "You branded over it." The agent leaned forward. "Mrs. Clara Ames, widow, and the last rightful owner of 40 Mile Hollow." Reese laid a folded document beside the saddle, weathered, soot-stained, but signed. "Original deed," he said, "found in her lockbox. You can compare the signatures." Ward stood slowly, face reddening. "This is nonsense. She's just a cook." "She was a wife, a mother, and a survivor," Reese cut in. "You tried to burn her off the land because she wouldn't sell. That ends tonight." The agent hesitated. "This needs a formal hearing." "Then call it one," Clara snapped. "Right here, right now." What followed wasn't a trial, in the usual sense. There was no judge, no jury, just truth laid bare in a room full of witnesses. Reese's quiet testimony, Clara's burned wrist, the recovered quilt scrap, the surveyor's missing payment records, evidence stitched together like a wound healing in public. Ward tried to bluster, threatened lawyers, raised his voice, until Reese finally stepped forward and pressed his palm flat on the saddle's scarred surface. "You left this behind, Elias, along with a child's name. You branded your greed over a boy's memory. That's all the court I need." Ward lunged, hand reaching toward his coat, but Clara was faster. Her pistol came up smooth and calm, aimed not to kill, but to freeze time. And it did. He stopped cold, then sat down. They didn't arrest him that night, but the land agent seized his claims pending investigation, and every man in town knew justice had shifted. As they rode out, Clara didn't speak, but Reese looked over and saw her hand finally ease away from the pistol. Her grip loosened. Her eyes turned forward. She hadn't come back to town for revenge. She'd come to reclaim what no fire could take: her name, her land, and her voice. The trail home looked different now, not because the hills had changed, but because Clara, no longer looked over her shoulder. Reese rode beside her, quiet as ever, but there was a weight gone from the way he held his reins. Scout ran ahead of them, tail high, nose to the wind, as if he too sensed the shift. When they crested the ridge above 40 Mile Hollow, the earth still bore scars, charred fence posts, blackened soil where the barn once stood. But wildflowers had begun to creep through the ashes. Patches of gold and violet pushed up defiantly through soot. Clara dismounted first, boots crunching soft against the dirt. She stepped to the mesquite tree where she'd buried the doll and the biscuit, knelt, and pressed her hand to the stone. She didn't cry, Not anymore. She just breathed, like the land had handed her lungs back. Reese unpacked quietly, helping her set up the canvas tent for shelter, though she refused to take the main wagon. "I want to rebuild from the earth up," she said, "not from what burned." That night they built a small fire. This one contained gentle, nothing like the roaring flames that once stole her world. Clara cooked simple food over it, and Reese took second helpings without a word. When the meal was done, they sat side by side on a log that had half burned but refused to fall. "You'll plant again?" he asked. She nodded. "With the rains, maybe by fall. Wheat first, then beans." He watched the flames flicker against her face. "And if he comes back? Then I'll show him what a woman who survived fire can grow in ash." He smiled faintly at that. Not the wide grin of a cowboy, but something deeper. A man who had watched something break, and then watched it rise again. Clara pulled out the pistol, checked the chamber, and placed it carefully back into the lockbox, then buried it beneath a loose board inside the wagon. "Not because I'm done," she said, "but because I don't want it to be the first thing I reach for anymore." Reese tipped his hat. "That's how you know you've won." As the stars emerged, Scout curled at her feet again, just as he had that first night. But now there was no trembling in her hands, no fear in her eyes, only the quiet power of someone who had faced the darkest hour and stepped through it without burning away. Clara Ames was no longer just a cook, a widow, or a woman running from flames. She was the keeper of land, the bearer of a name, and the one thing the fire couldn't touch, the root that stayed.